there, and welcome to Military Histories, a podcast from York Army Museum. Each week we share an interview from the Royal Dragoon Guards audio archive. This season we will be sharing interviews with veterans of the Korean War. You can find more details about the Royal Dragoon Guards Oral History Project in the show notes. If you want to find out a bit more about our museum, there are links to our website and social media channels in the show notes too. In this interview you can hear Major Peter Duckworth speaking specifically about Korea. Thanks for listening. Future episodes will drop every Friday.
National Army Museum, Tuesday the 22nd of March 1994, oral history interview with Major Peter Duckworth. So you sailed for Korea from Liverpool, I think you
Yes.
said, in October 1951. Had you actually been engaged in training in advance of going out?
In training?
Yes. For
Well, yes, the regiment had come from Germany.
Right, yeah.
And it eventually transpired that the infantry brigades that we'd been training with in Germany followed us out as replacements for the infantry already there.
Yeah. So
And
you
we
went from Germany and you took all your tanks and equipment and everything?
No, we took out, no, the tanks stayed in Germany. We took over the tanks of the 8th Hussars when we got there. That was the aim. So we came back, the regiment came back to Aldershot, and generally geared up there, and sailed and went from Liverpool by SS Georgic, which was a great experience. I don't think any of us had actually, well, no one I knew there had actually trooped by ship before, and that was getting to the end of the troop ship era. And it was really rather wonderful in a way, sailing from Liverpool, because we sailed towards evening. We'd all had lunch in Liverpool, a sort of great send-off lunch. And as we waved to the people who'd been there to come to see us off, it was still, I remember it must have been light enough, because I can remember seeing people who recognizing them. And as we sailed down the Mersey and the light was failing, all the ship's company, or I say the ship's company, all the troops, took to singing. And it was an amazing and emotional send-off, really. And of course, one of the great rages of that era was "Good night, Irene, good night, Irene." And the echoes of that were swilling across the Mersey. The next thing one really was conscious of was actually being taken close in to Estoril, because the captain of the boat was a renowned navigator called Snaky Williams, because of his navigational skills. And he sailed us as close to as much land as he could to make it interesting. And so we sailed uneventfully through the Mediterranean and stopping, obviously just stopping at Port Said, but not to dismount. The bumboats all came round and we bought things, and then we sailed on through the Suez Canal. And as we sailed through the Suez Canal, the Royal Dragoons, who are great old friends of ours, all came out with their armoured cars and waved from the various points along the line. Because at that time, you'll remember, a little bit of an emergency was cropping up in Egypt. We then arrived in Aden, where we did dismount and looked around for a bit. Next stop was deadly hot going down the Red Sea. Terribly hot, with the following wind, which didn't help. Twice, Snaky Williams turned the ship round to give us a blow.
Oh, right.
And clear the air through. And then eventually we reached Colombo, where we did luxuriate in, I think it was about 24 hours probably, and had dined and wined and did all the things we ought to do, and then re-embarked. Next stop, Singapore, where again it was, we had a short stop, but I think to remember it was something like 36 hours. Then on to Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong to Busan, where SS Georgic was the largest ship, passenger ship, or any ship that had ever gone into Busan. Again, I imagine great credit to Snaky Williams. On the voyage, quite a number of things took place. We started each day with physical training, running around the decks, round and round and round.
Was yours the only regiment on the ship?
No, well, we were the main regiment,
right, yeah.
so therefore we were virtually in charge.
Yeah.
But no, there were drafts from other ships, and that happens. And, and some were getting. It was rather like a sort of train or a bus stop. People were getting off here, and the last. I think the last lot that I can recall closely, people I was associated with, got off at Singapore, who were 13th, 18th Hussars, who were going to Malaya. Not, I mean, only a few of them. Yeah. And I got in touch with them particularly because one of their officers was a friend of mine who I'd been instructing with at Mons Officer Cadet School.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So then on, but each day, as it started with PT, we then had various forms of training, weapon training and so on. I ran the shooting gallery at the rear of the ship. That posed all sorts of problems of creating targets, from throwing over on horses old unwanted furniture to tying balloons, and eventually to throwing offal and stuff to try and attract sharks. But anyway, somehow we managed to keep enough interest in shooting going for most of the voyage. Running alongside that too were intensive Morse training, because it was thought that we were going to operate possibly at such long distances that wirelesses would be, and in the hilly country, would not be so effective, and so we would need to use Morse. So we all sweated away at Morse, but in fact I think to aim at 5 words per minute minimum. And but eventually when we got to Korea, I don't think we ever touched a Morse key. They may have done it at RHQ, but I don't think so. I didn't come across it. So into Busan on the 2nd of, or the 1st of December, very cold, and decanting ourselves into that really harsh Korean climate fresh from a luxury troop ship. Although you might not say it was a luxury ship, it was compared with looking back on it, it looked very luxurious. Gone were the iced gin and tonics and so on. And we then had to carry our kit about 1,000 yards to the railway station. And a lot of kit to be carried, and we weren't all, what you might call, in spite of the PT, in our best physical shape, I would think. So anyway, that was quite a burden. And then we got onto the troop train of the 40 men, 8 horse variety, with three sort of benches running longitudinally along each side. And if you were on a low bunk, you couldn't sit properly on it. Or you could just, but your head would be just bumping the bunk above. Very restricted movement. Feeding was brought through in hot canisters, as it were, and dished out, rather like field cooking, as it were. And we were on that train for 36 hours, and we arrived eventually at the Commonwealth Division rail point called Uijeongbu, where we were met by some elements of the 8th Hussars, and then taken up to their rear area. And almost immediately we had to re-kit, and none of us had any idea of what sort of kit we were going to have, because we had heard stories about how bitterly cold it had got and how wet and how everything else. But by the time we got there, the British kit was probably the best on record. Very good. And we all turned into our combat kit, which consisted of the same thing as we have today, a combat suit, but a parka, which was sort of artificially fur-lined, which had a tail which made you look like a duck-billed platypus and from the rear, and everyone looked very quaint. But that could be pulled up between your crutch and strapped up in front, and it had a hood, built-in hood, and so it was fairly good protection against that sort of weather. And then we had boots wet cold. They hadn't been thought of before, but they were heavy boots with composite rubber soles, ribbed and everything else, as we've got used to nowadays, and puttees. And they were on the whole waterproof, up to the ankle.
Yeah.
And warm, because they also had a thing called, again, we'd never come across it before, but a thing called an insole, a plastic thing which fitted in, and that gave you wonderful insulation from the ground. Well, having got ourselves kitted up, then the squadrons went straight out to take over from their respective opposite numbers. And I think by the night of the 6th, everybody was in position. And we'd said goodbye to the 8th Hussars, and they were very happy to go. We were sorry to be there, probably. See, looking round, say, well, we're here, getting over the shock, and then taking stock of the countryside, and that is phenomenal, really. The only roads that were there, laterally and in between the main roads, had been built by the Americans. They were hardcore roads with dust. They were very dusty in dry weather and a bit treacherous sometimes in wet weather and icy weather. And one relied on them entirely for our communications. Jeep, of course, was an invaluable asset, because you could go almost anywhere on a Jeep, and if it did get into trouble, you could lift it out. I always admired that from the end of the Second World War. The Jeep was a marvellous vehicle. We tried to imitate it with the Rover and something else, but we never achieved the Austin Jeep, and we never achieved that degree of mobility that that Willis Jeep conferred on us. Well, once in the line and once there taking stock, it took time to get used to the countryside, time to get used to the routine. But the routine followed, I suppose, the same as it's followed over the centuries almost. You stand to at first light, you stand to at last light, and you have whatever activities going on in between, and you get to know your supporting cast, as it were, or the people we were supporting, the infantry. And the early days were obviously very much devoted to getting ourselves known and established. Yes. And then, of course, but it's a very quick time, because you're straight into an operational situation. There's no question of drawing breath. You're in there at last light. Yes. And really, at first light, you've got to be functioning. So, from then on, it was this routine of having 2 squadrons in the line and 1 in reserve for the rest of the time we were there. And you stayed in the line for about 6 weeks or 2 months, and you were out for a month. And when you were in the line, you had these daily stand tos. You had the intermittent shelling that went on, and this was all quite early days. The shelling was, as we came to know it, was really comparatively light and didn't affect us much. Freedom of movement was there, because we had complete air superiority. We did not see an opposition aeroplane at all. And the only interesting thing about the air side of it was that the effectiveness of ground fire by the Chinese on our low-flying aircraft. They just put up a wall of small arms fire, which I think I only saw 1 plane shot down by it, but I spoke to a pilot or 2, and they gave the impression that it did offer some sort of frightening experience for them. Sure. And you could hear, we couldn't see what, because the Chinese were all in their trenches all the time, and they were just firing. You could hear pop, 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 pop. It went on.
So did you respond to that? Or?
Well, if we saw it, and if we could see any movement, the tank would get onto it. And you know, a tank gun is very, very accurate. And we had ×10 binoculars built in, and they could scan and they could focus on things. We picked up quite a lot of things, and we pinpointed various things like that. Always where possible, either with the high explosive or sometimes AP. If you were trying to put it into something, you occasionally used armour piercing, but not very often, mainly HE. And machine gun fire. So, and so that went on until the spring. Now the weather up till then had been very severe. Lovely days on the whole, but about every third day you had this penetrating Siberian wind, which would practically go through armour, and it came at you laterally. Very, very cold, and to such an extent that if you touched metal, at that time you would stick to it. One or two people did. And if you happened to hazard an ordinary chicken's egg into the cold and you wanted to eat it, you could, first of all, you could peel it and have a crystallized spheroid in your hand, or if you wanted to eat it boiled, you get it soft boiled by boiling it for 8 minutes to give you some idea of the condition of it.
And you were living in what, tents?
Well, a combination. In the line, rather like the infantry, the troops were in dugouts, heavily fortified dugouts, and bunkers, and in some cases latterly tunnels. And towards the end of the campaign, particularly on the left where the Americans had been, the Marine Division, there were tunnels. They started tunnels, and the sappers had improved them, and the Black Watch helped them do that. But the general run was bunkers and trenches. Yep. And in reserve, we were able to live in tents because we were on the whole, not entirely, but on the whole behind the artillery range, or behind the observable artillery range. And so we were, I think, fairly secure in that respect. When in reserve, it meant we came south of the Imjin. Yes. And I think there was quite a distance problem there. Anyway, there we had tents, and but also what we call bashers. The troops made their own little hutches, as it were, to live in. Sometimes those were still underground. In the line, it was difficult for some people. A very tall officer we had always had a problem because he never went back to the same place twice, and always the bed that you dug out was made in a sort of on the whole a sort of shelf in the dugout, and of course he always had to extend it, and which was awkward for him.
What sort of fuel did you use to keep warm?
What sort of fuel? A mixture. Obviously there was a certain amount of wood, but on the whole we used either petrol or diesel. Petrol was terribly hazardous, and the Americans produced a thing called a space heater, which was a funny globular shaped bit of metal with a pipe which went straight up, and that was fed in through a valve either by petrol or diesel, and it got very warm. It gave out tremendous heat, but it had a propensity to run away. And once it started running away, there's nothing you could do about it. You could switch off the fuel, but it was started. And if it was in a tent, it was an additional hazard because you could see this red, hot thing going up like a snail up the chimney, until it reached the tent roof, and the whole thing had gone.
Yes.
And that was particularly a curse for newcomers. Any time a new battalion or new regiment came, you always found they had their crop of burnt down tents. Awful, and it didn't. You weren't always immune from it, even towards the end. But that was what happened. The other sort of fuel, diesel was the safest. You could control that more easily. But another sort of fuels, they improvised all the time, and we used to get shell cases, and we gave a lot of these to the infantry. We got our Remy to cut out a hole in the bottom, and by putting the same thing in the bottom, a little jet, you could, and a chimney on top, you could get the same. So, I mean, space heaters were the American type, were I won't say few and far between, but they weren't easy to come by. And so you might have one a squadron or two a squadron or something like that. Whereas, really, with that cold and in reserve, you wanted one everywhere. Right. And in the line, if you could, too. So, particularly in the line, we gave a lot of these shell cases. to the infantry and to our troops. And another form, of course, is the old oil and water drip, which was never really as satisfactory as pure petrol or diesel. And so that was that. And the rations we had, they, I think, were amazing, really. I'd never come across better rations, and with a little bit of casting around and private enterprise, one squadron quartermaster sergeant, who was the supply man, and a little bit of black market, was able to really spice up the diet with all sorts of things. And quite often we had lovely things like huge turkeys. And I used to, initially I was second in command, and I used to get these turkeys and cook them up in the rear at squadron headquarters, and send them out in hot boxes to cut up to the troops in the line, to give them an extra fillip. And then we had very popular, some American food, which we changed. They loved bully beef. Well, I think we got rather tired. I personally have never been a fan of bully beef, but anyway, we were able to barter bully beef for the things that they had a superfluity of, such as corn, Indian corn, which we thought was lovely, particularly the whole one. Yeah. But they had both, the mashy sort and that, and they were always very keen to offload that. So there was, and it was amazing. I think we each loved each other's rations to a certain extent, but I think they loved ours more. And we had a lot of fresh meat, and I would say that a very wholesome diet we had there. And our cooks were all extremely good, and the distribution was good. It was always hot when necessary. So that was the pattern of life. Of course, with all that, there was an enormous amount of socializing, because you were getting to know people all the time, and you were having visitors, you were liaising, and there was a great deal of what you might call spontaneous hospitality. Yeah. And if you dropped in on someone, you would be given a drink, or you'd give them tea, or you would give them lunch, or whatever. Free-flowing all across the front. And if you read a diary, you'll find that so-and-so came for drinks, we went somewhere else for dinner, we played cards here. Cards played an enormous part certainly in reserve and in parties, and roulette we played a lot of. So that was part of life, so the socializing. From top to bottom, people came. We were very lucky. There was a great singer, I don't know if you remember him, called Bill Johnson, who was in one of those early musicals, Annie Get Your Gun, or one of those things. Well, he came out with an English comedian from the Crazy Gang, whose name escapes me just at the moment, Peter somebody, I've forgotten his name. But anyway, he came out, and they gave us one or two concerts around the divisional front, and they came to us, and we invited them up and gave them dinner. Which was very entertaining for us, and I hope for them too. And we were in the line at the time, but we came to squadron headquarters, and he poked around and visited some of the troops, which it was big stuff, because quite often one got used to people writing war sort of stories and people. Actors and so on, talking about how they'd been frightened by the gook here and there, or whatever. In fact, it had never been further forward than Corps headquarters, probably. And really hairy battle stories told of way back. Further forward, it was, we'd got to the spring, and by that time the Chinese artillery was becoming very much more effective. It was noticeably heavier, noticeably more frequent, and then we think, they, directed by Russian masters, they were able to produce switching, that is, ranging on one target quite away, and then working out their switch from there and dropping everything they'd got on another. And one of the, if not the first, one of the first examples of that on our front was when that treatment was handed out to our squadron headquarters, which caused an absolute mayhem. A couple of chaps killed, several wounded, including me, and it was an unpleasant experience. Demolished a number of vehicles. And from then on, that really was the pattern of that. And whenever they attacked, you could depend on an enormous barrage. And in fact, I think it was said at the time, they put down on one hill, 355, when they attacked it later on in the year, as much ammunition as has been expended at the Battle of Alamein. It was horrendous. And we had a troop up there, and they attacked, and they overran one of the company positions, but then were repulsed. Yep. And I went up early the following morning, and I was simply staggered. The whole area was almost unrecognizable from what it had been. These, what they called crawl trenches, I'll call them trenches, which had been 8 feet, I suppose, sometimes 8 feet or more deep, and revetted and all very firm, had in many cases on the forward slope been reduced to just rain-swept runnels in the ground, just like that. A terrific bombardment, and that happened on several occasions. But particularly there, and particularly right towards the end of our time, when they made a determined attempt to take out one of our positions called the Hook, which was on the extreme left of the Commonwealth Division. And I think the first and second battles of the Hook are well recorded. One by the Black Watch, which I think was the first one, and the second by the Duke of Wellington's, I think it was. So that was the second one was after our time. The first one occurred just before we left in November. But that was among other things, one of the great difficulties of their shelling, because their observation was quite good too, and their DFing was good. So it made any movement on an exposed area, which had up till then been fairly free and easy, made it very difficult, and all supplies and all movement on the whole was done before first light or after last light. And the other thing about that particular activity was that they patrolled very intensively, and their patrols were very courageous. They seemed, in some instances, to have a facility for just walking across our minefields. They did some astonishing things. For instance, it was known that on Christmas Day 1951, they came across the minefields and laid toys and presents on the wire in front of our positions, without anyone knowing. And they also did, I think, a little bit. They were known to penetrate between our positions, because if you can imagine, the whole of the front was really a series of fortified hills, and in between the hills there was nothing. So your movement up and back, say later on, usually in the dark, quite sometimes in the day, it wasn't always like that, but certainly the exposed positions like 159, it was rarity unless you had a real urgent case to go to in the day. You would go in darkness. But if the Chinese penetrated, they were able to ambush anybody, any movement going up to the hills. And as one's really turned what you might call day into night, or night into day into night really, from a lot of operating things, it meant that one was, certainly as a squadron leader towards the end, one was motoring around between positions a great deal in darkness. Now, as to the individual operations, my regiment actually took part in, I suppose you would call it 3 armoured raids altogether, if not 4. 3, I think it was. And they were principally in the winter when the ground was was solid, and they had limited objectives. Half a squadron went out and crossed the valley floor and started climbing up the opposite side, and with a view to establishing a position where they could put fairly close range shot right into the bunkers, which were known to be there. The one on the right, they did two together. One as a sort of diversion on the left of the front, and the other done by our B squadron. But the main one done on the right of the front, straight through point 159, which was our promontory sticking out. And that was of limited value, really, I think, in that it didn't manage to get quite to where it should have done, and didn't achieve what was hoped it would. It may have given the Chinese a shock. It may have given them the idea that we were going to have an offensive. That went up, and one of our troop leaders in the leading troop was pretty courageous and managed to extricate himself, having been set on fire. He got out and on the enemy hillside and got the thing, put the fire out, and they got the tank back. One or two tanks cast their tracks, which was a difficult thing, and a couple were left out in no man's land overnight. On the far left, the B squadron attack, which was a very much more limited one and really diversionary, was really not at all effective. The slopes that it went up were terribly slippery, terribly steep, and it didn't get even to its objective, and it had to be called off. It was quite evident that it was not tank country. And when we did training with the infantry, it was extraordinary. You could drive on the tops of the hills, but they would be the bean fields. And curious enough, the surface, the soil, the topsoil, or whatever you like to call it, was really so soft and so slippery that if you traversed a hill, you had every chance, and most people did at one time or another, of sliding off your tracks. The track would stick below the thing, and you would then slide off it, and so you would lose your track. It was quite easy to go through paddy fields on the whole, which was surprising. But on the whole, you went through a paddy field either straight down top to bottom, or vice versa, or across, and of course they were flat, so you didn't sort of slip off them. But casting tracks was an absolute occupational hazard there. I think, I won't say most tanks did, but there were a lot of occasions when the tanks, moving into the line, for instance, one of my tanks was moving up into the right-hand position in November, and it caused great sort of delay getting in because it cast a track going up to this very steep, what I call it a mountain, 0.355. And on other occasions they had problems with that.
And could they be replaced?
The tracks?
Yeah.
Oh yes, but sometimes you had to blow the track pin out.
Right.
And somebody actually did that once with the commanding officers watching after one of these raids, and he somehow put all the charges he had in one go, and the commanding officer suddenly found the sprocket flying past his head. There was great dismay, and the following morning that corporal found himself without two stripes. That was the general form. With the metal being so cold, it was so difficult to deal with, and you man your hands and everything else. And of course the slippery going.
Yes.
It was amazing how the machinery worked. Thing we did have breakdowns. The auxiliary generators broke down, and tanks had to be brought out, and things like that. Some tanks got direct hits from very heavy artillery, and 120. It's not pleasant being hit by, even if you're in a tank, by a 122 millimeter shell.
No, I suppose it is.
And even if it lands nearby, you'll get a bit shaken. But I think the tanks survived remarkably well. and all the equipment that went with them.
I mean, there wasn't any problem about shortages of spares or anything?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think they had. I think our LAD and our technical adjutant had a constant headache. I think, really. They were amazing the way they kept things going. But I wouldn't have said it was easy. It wasn't a thing that I experienced myself as a great problem. I think partly because we had such very good fitters.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know, but just before we went to Korea, the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers took over the role of the fitters with squadrons, just as the ACC did later and took over the cooking.
Yeah.
You had your specialist mechanics. Well, all those chaps, in fact, until they turned the switch over, had worn regimental badges.
Yeah.
And then overnight they wore Remy badge. But they were absolutely marvellous. And we had one little chap in my squadron called Newport, Ernie Newport, who was corporal. His father had been the farrier sergeant major in the regiment before the war, who was also a tremendous character. And Newport was involved in the, apart from being an extremely good fitter and the calmest, a courageous chap, he was involved in the shelling of my headquarters and in the salvaging of the casualties. And his calmness under fire was marvellous to see him. I mean, a tremendous lot of stuff coming down. And sitting with the casualties which were redeemable, so to speak, propped up against the side of a tank, being treated by him as if he was in Piccadilly, in fact. Very good. He got to mention it. I'd rather think he deserved, if you're going to go into it, I'm not quite sure I'm terribly supportive of the award system, because you single people out. A lot of people are being enormously courageous, not all the time, but when the occasion demands, and a lot of it isn't seen. But he was seen, and he was extremely inspiring. And one's seen other people doing this, other things, but that sticks in my mind, just the picture of him.
Yes, I can imagine.
Kneeling beside these two casualties beside the tank. Now, going to the operation that we discussed about in the Project Korea, Operation Pimlico, that was an extraordinary enterprise. In that, I can't remember, my earliest recollection of it was a talk at the beginning of November. I think there was further mention of it that I can remember on the 8th of November. The battle captain, or battle adjutant, a man called Dudley Schofield from the Royal Fusiliers, came round to my headquarters to discuss it, have lunch with me and discuss Pimlico, among other things, on the 10th. The operation went on was scheduled for the 23rd. And now that was a time when people were beginning to be warned about security, because people were getting lax about it. And I think there was a lot of talk about it there, too much talk. It had gone on and on. And when the first attempt was made for Pimlico, at about 1:30, we could tell on the radio that things weren't going well. And at 1:30 on the radio, it was cancelled, because the reason given then was that they'd been compromised. It said radio reports indicated that the operation had been compromised. And then, 24 hours later, it was put on again. And from the word go, it was evident to me, sitting literally in a fast fall position, not able to see a great lot because it was dark, but sitting up there, that things had gone drastically wrong before HR. In that they had a forming up place, which was just ahead of our forward position, point 159. There was this high point, and then ahead of 159 there was a sort of mound, and that was the forming up point. The first people to move on to that encountered opposition. And so that gave one a very nasty feeling. Yeah. And then, in spite of that, they probably cleared it. I can't remember exactly, but I think they must have cleared that. There was I think there was a firefight. Well, there must have been. And I think that was cleared. But the operation went on. And my recollection of it at the time was that they had run straight into an ambush. From crossing the start line, they were completely compromised because they didn't get anywhere. And there was a great deal of chaos. And it muddled the talk on the air. Gave one a very uncomfortable, frightened feeling that things had gone wrong. And in fact, I think that's what happened. I think the Chinese had a sort of hollow square round this forming up point, and I think they just took the Royal Fusiliers out. Fusiliers had a number of casualties then. Some were left out, and it was nothing short of heroic the next morning, the way cooks were streaming out across the front line to try and bring in casualties. It was a most amazing incident altogether. Well, I went to see Colonel Dick Stevens first thing that morning, and my impression of him then was that he was a deeply shocked man. And I think that it was a very bad decision to have gone ahead with that after once being compromised. Yeah. And then having your forming up point. I think there comes a time when you have, at any time, when you've got to be sufficiently flexible to be able to cry a halt.
Yes. Yes. Were the Chinese listening to the radio track?
Well, I imagine they must. I mean, I don't. We were, again, I think I can remember reprimanding two troop leaders, particularly actually round about the time of the shelling of our headquarters. One then, particularly that, because he just came on there and virtually said we were being shelled. Well, so the Chinese knew what they were up to then.
Yes, quite.
So anyway, I think they must have had listening watches. I mean, they're not fools, and although they were very peasant-orientated, so to speak, they had some quite sharp customers around, and they had the Russians helping them, I'm sure. But one of the things about the Chinese was their incredible fieldcraft. I mean, they would move, and they would move a whole army practically, and it would go to ground. And the reason they were able to do it, I think, was that they carried camouflage umbrellas. And you walk along with your umbrella, and you go anywhere, and you drop to the ground and put your umbrella up, and you're obscured. That was one thing, because they were able to move quite substantial numbers of men without people really realizing. And on a couple of occasions or so, they managed to get the attacking troops right under a Commonwealth position. When and how, I don't know, but before the attack. So they didn't come across no man's land, just so they were, they'd hold up. And that was particularly so, I think, with the attack on 355. And I think it could have been so with the attack on the Hook, the first, or certainly the first attack on the Hook.
Yeah.
But that was the pattern of the war. Naturally, it always happened. Maybe it's just us as a nation. I think if things get a bit easy, we take things easily. And I think there was an air of jollity, I would say, of light-heartedness when you hadn't got to be really serious, and I think that sort of crept through. The general sort of bonhomie. The serious business was right up at the sharp end, and the moment you were involved in that, of course, it was deadly serious. Behind, it was no less serious, but it was all lubricated by one's social life, really.
Yes. Yes, two very different sets of circumstances,
Totally.
in fact.
But that was the contrast. I thought perhaps it was rather like, particularly commanding a squadron and being a little bit back from the front and going up all the time. I felt, and then going back to the relative security of my headquarters, a little bit like a fighter pilot in the war. You go out and you have a thing, and then you come back to your base, as it were, which was undoubtedly more comfortable than sitting absolutely in the front line. And we did lots of things with our back areas. Our gooks, the Korean labour force, were very skilled carpenters and so on, and they put up all sorts of things for us, which we tell them what we wanted. And I'll show you a picture of it here. They did an enormous amount of building, and they must have done for other people revetting of trenches and things. But so we were able to make ourselves very comfortable. And you then had to move, and you had to do it again, so you were adaptable. But the great thing about it all, which was a direct contrast to Egypt when we arrived there, because we went straight to Egypt from Busan, was that there was always endless scope for self-help. You could barter, you could make, you could do all sorts of things. You would live off the country. And so therefore there was an added spice to life. And when you got to Egypt, it was all back to the really peacetime soldiering when it wasn't really peacetime, and to the Queen's regulations and so on.
Right. So that gets us up. I'm just trying to think about sort of the end of the spring.
So,
June, I think we said.
Yes, well, June. Well, June was really hot and torrid. Lovely, I mean, very sunny, and we bathed. We gained by improvisation. The wadi, or whatever we like to call it, that we parked in and were flooded out of, we actually eventually turned into a swimming pool. We dammed one end of it, and we made with sandbags, and we made a very good facility of swimming for us, which was on our doorstep. But then the rain was with us, and I say the humidity, and of course the mosquitoes, dreaded mosquitoes. And the monsoon, I don't think they call it a monsoon there, but it was. It was humid and it was rainy, and the Imjin rose, as I noted on one occasion, 40-odd feet in 16 hours. They had just completed the two high-level bridges by that time. One was called Pintail, which was a very solid construction and had been the main supply route north beforehand. And the other was called Teal, which looked a much more flimsy, high-flown bridge on stilts. And from a very early start in the flooding proceeding, that bridge looked under threat. And I crossed it literally minutes before it was demolished. I went across, the water was less than 4 feet below the roadway. The bridge was vibrating, and I think possibly I was the last vehicle allowed on it. And I got across, and I thought, well, there's something's going to happen, so I motored round to a point of vantage, and only just in time to see the middle two spans swept away in the water. That was an area where only a very short time before we had driven across, literally underneath that bridge.
Gosh, yes.
Only a very short time before, because the river was completely dried out, or as near as made no difference. And It had been, I see on the maps, both it and the Pintail site are marked as ferries beforehand, so that's why they were chosen, obviously. So that bridge went, which left us really only one way of crossing the Imjin. And we went on into the autumn from there with the usual same old routine, changing round. In reserve, we played games, we did physical training, we did troop training, we trained with the infantry, practicing, getting to know them, the new infantry coming in, and generally making and mending, and having as enjoyable time as we could. We had concert parties, we had our own. One squadron had a fair, like a country fair, and we had football matches and rugby matches and so on. And then the weather started to get cold.
Yes, so let's go back a bit. In the monsoon, was there a sort of lull in military activity?
No. It was everything went on very much because it. No, it wouldn't stop. It just made everything very, very difficult, slippery and slimy, and and so it was saturated a lot of the time. Very heavy rain and very persistent, but it was warm rain. So that I suppose you could endure that. Of course, once bashers leaked because they hadn't been built with that aim in view, and initially you hadn't thought of rain.
You presumably weren't wearing parkas in the rain, were you?
No. We from about May, we'd switched to jungle green.
Right.
And we had the parka. We had, but we didn't use them much. They were so hot. It was and I can't remember how I really can't remember how we kept dry. We didn't keep dry. I mean, jungle green is very thin, and it will dry off in the sun in no time at all. After the rain, you'd get some hot sun. My memory on that is completely blank, but we wouldn't have worn parkas because it was really hot and humid. And so from there, I say, then it began to dry up, and autumn came upon us, and consistent with experiences throughout the world where you have very cold weather in the winter, Canada, Scotland, elsewhere, you had most marvellous autumn tints. And just digressing there, what was interesting was the shrub on the whole, on the hillsides, was all what they called sort of dwarf poison oak. It was, if you walked through it with bare knees, you got sort of rash from it. And the hillsides, the upper range of the hillsides were covered with this sort of what I think we call poison oak, because it had sort of oak leaves, but they never grew very big. And so all the leaves, whatever you saw on the trees, there was this wonderful colouring attached to them. And then that went, and then the weather started getting cold. And we were then saying to ourselves, well, of course, I suppose it's used to it. It wasn't all as bad as we thought it was. I mean, when we arrived in December last year, we thought that it was very cold. I mean, the winter was very cold, but here we are in winter. We've got the frosts around and everything else, and it doesn't really feel at all bad. And then suddenly, the good Lord decided to take the bottom out of the thermometer overnight, as it were, and temperatures plummeted down, and we knew where we were again. It was terribly cold, and the engine froze, and everything else froze. And but then, with the cold weather, it seemed perhaps that things got more intensive again. There started to be talk about what the Chinese would call the sixth phase offensive, and that was on everybody's lips at one stage. Any movement was thought to be all gearing up for the sixth phase offensive. And indeed, the attack on 355 and the attack on the Hook and various other movements, great movements, suggested that might be so, because there was a period in that time when any plane that went over excited an enormous response from enemy fire.
Oh, right.
As if they were trying to make a no-go area.
I see. Yes.
And it was eventually put down to changing a division. With hindsight, and really talking after we left, I would think probably that was gearing up for this attack on the Hook, because that was all to our left on the whole.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, there was a lot of intensive patrol activity. A lot of there were these Chinese raids, and there was a great deal of talk. We did a lot of firing to discourage the raids, and we did a lot of firing on points. And then first time we thought we saw a tank, and we looked at it, and it looked suspiciously like a tank. And the troop leader saw it first, and I was quite close to him when he first saw it. And he said, "What do you think that is?" And I looked and I said, "It's a tank." So we fired at it. And no, I think I've got it slightly wrong. I think the tank had fired at us first. And it could be the other way around, but anyway, this is what I think happened. The tank fired at us first, and it hit the tank, one of our tanks, it was splintered. And we sent the shell fragments off for analysis. Mm-hmm. And it turned out to be, they thought, an 85 millimeter shot from something like a Ju-85 or a tank, similar tank. Mm. Anyway, we thought we saw this tank, and we had a go at it. We didn't noticeably achieve anything, but I think shortly after, and I can't really say exactly when, our photographs confirmed really that there were tank tracks that there had been a tank there. Mm-hmm. And further over on the front, at one stage, Joseph Stalin was reported, but not in my front, and not in my responsibility, as it were. But that was some excitement coming towards the end. But again, it was suggestive that they were hotching up something. Mm. Then came the end. I mean, the end was full of activity, because we had Pimlico, which came in November the 25th eventually, I think it was. Mm-hmm. But just before Pimlico, the Black Watch had been attacked on the Hook. Mm-hmm. And then after that, there was a lot of sort of attacking and bombardment of 355. So really, I would have said that, looking back, November and beginning of December were a fairly active period. Well, then came the advance party of the first tanks who took over from us, followed by the main body, who arrived about the same program as us, I think 4th, 5th, something like that, of December. Mm. And I think in this case it was the 8th. I think we were pulled out and completely handed over on the 8th and withdrew over the Imjin. And I couldn't resist stopping and taking a last photograph of the Imjin. By that time it was frozen over solidly, only to be moved on by a military policeman. But we then went off to our train. Snow was I'm sorry, we hadn't mentioned the snow. We did get snow in November, and the positions were all absolutely covered in snow, making it difficult to move on the hillside sometimes. And in fact, I can remember at one stage visiting one of my troops' tanks on a hill called 210, which was just slightly back from point 159, and slithering the whole way from the top of the hill to the bottom of my bottom, because it was just impossible to stand. but very little snow, relatively. I mean, I don't know what happened. Heavy fall there at that time, but I don't know. We left when it was there, and so I don't know how long it lasted after that. But the previous year we'd had remarkably little snow, very dry, cold all the time. And that we had a great snow fight at the station. I can remember the boys having great frolics, throwing snowballs at everybody, and great joie de vivre, and then getting on the same old troop train, 40 men and 8 horses, and down to Busan, where we had a great sort of commemorative service in the cemetery. We eventually boarded the ship, this time the Empire Hatterdale, which was a more comfortable ship from an officer's point of view, where you had the old-fashioned staterooms, mahogany, wood everywhere, and really the height of luxury. But the soldiery had, I think, a very thin time of it, and it was not pleasant, although they weren't all that well served on the Georgic, but better, I think, than the Hallidale. And so we set off, and the same old story in reverse. Stopped off at Hong Kong and Singapore, Ceylon and Aden, and then Port Said. And the ship went on from Port Said, leaving the bulk of the regiment to go down to Shandur, which was a vast desert camp on the Great Bitter Lake, right towards the south, south of Fide. Fide was the sort of centre headquarters of the area. But there we were instantly into an internal security situation, and you went around fully armed, and there were several instances of people being ambushed and shot at, and things raided, particularly in Moaska, which was a more sort of general centre of population than Fide. Fide was much more military.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And but Moaska had many more civilians, and there were various instances there of people running into trouble with what I don't know what you call terrorist gangs or whatever. But you never moved without your sidearms, and if you went out to dinner, you took your sidearms, you put them on the hall table, as it were.
Yes. Good. Now, getting back to when you went to Korea, did you know that you were only going for a year? I mean, that was...
Yes, that was, well, approximately.
Yeah, sort of years post. And presumably quite a lot of the men were national service.
Yes, they were. And they were absolutely marvellous. It was, well, we were told when we went that they would be with us for the whole period, regardless. But in fact, by about July, I think some were coming up for release, as was time-serving regulars. So we lost a number of people in that respect.
Yes.
But the national serviceman, this chap Corporal Manners I mentioned to you, he was a national serviceman, and there were some stars. We had national service NCOs, and I mean, the national service was, although in some respects people complained about it, was an absolute boon. I mean, the army gained an enormous amount of talent, rather like the war, and you had some amazing people. I mean, at a later date, certainly, but I mean, there are a number of people who were national service subalterns in my regiment, one of whom is Sir Christopher Bland, who's the chairman, was until recently chairman of London Weekend Television, involved in that great takeover, who was a marvellous young man, most enterprising fellow, and a delight to have around, and I think he still is. In spite of his tremendous rise to fame and fortune. But he wasn't alone. We had quite a number like that, and some of the soldiery. But that was rather like the soldiery in the war. We had, in my squadron in the Second World War, we had people who subsequently achieved all sorts of distinctions, who had just been troopers and lance corporals and so on.
Yes, but the situation was slightly different with national service, wasn't it? Because you'd only got them for a couple of years or something.
Well, yes. But yes,
so
it
you
was.
sort of knew they were going, whereas in the war they were there until
They were
the
there.
end of
Well,
the
but you see, you say we knew we were there for a year. You weren't to know that the war was going to go on that long.
No,
I mean, by the time we arrived, you see, the armistice negotiation was on, which was in fact just a ploy to stabilise the front by the Chinese because they were on the run.
Yeah, yeah.
And real cynical, well, a cynical, very clever plot, I suppose, really. And it's very interesting all that time when those negotiations were going on. Chinese were constantly tunnelling underneath the front line, and they exposed one or two tunnels which might have caused great trouble if they hadn't been found. Not in my time, but I read of them.
So the Chinese didn't have much in the way of air power then, but they had a lot of artillery.
Yes,
that would be
they had great strength with infantry and artillery.
Yeah,
and they're both very formidable.
Was there a tendency on the Allied side, as it were, to use tanks as artillery?
Not so much as artillery, no, because I don't think we ever really had sufficient ammunition to do that. We were in a curious situation. We were from time to time we were rationed.
Yeah.
But no, you see, our weapon wasn't really used for that sort of thing. I think we could be used for a specific task.
Yes.
On call when somebody was in trouble, and we could put pinpoint fire down instantly. No ranging, no nothing. Well, I know the artillery could do that with DF tasks, but we were able to do it on a more perhaps intimate way, because there was a tremendous intimacy between the platoon commander and the troop leader, and the company commander and the troop leader, and the crew commanders. They lived together on the hills, and they did everything together when they were up on the hill. Yeah. So they became absolutely as a family. Now, the machine gun and the direct fire.
Yeah.
It was a misuse, in a way. It was a misuse of tanks, obviously, to be a pillbox. Really, to be a pillbox.
Yeah.
That's what it amounts to.
Yes.
And they're very effective. But they did attract, as I said before, they did attract fire.
Yeah.
And unwholesome way. And there were some people who would much rather not have a tank on their position.
Yeah.